Hello and welcome. You already know this, or you should, but it needs to be said. Love is complicated. I'm not going to give you the 7 steps for fixing your relationship or your marriage. I'm going to offer something a lot more difficult to absorb, but far more valuable, I hope. A robust way of understanding what goes into intimate relationships, succeeding or failing. And by success, I mean a felt connection based on reciprocity. That might sound simple. It isn't. I'm attempting to distill what I've slowly learned from a lifetime of personal experience, including multiple heartbreaks and a divorce, many years of working therapeutically with individuals and couples, and book learning. I invite you to stick with me to the end of this video, but if you need to take a break, please come back. If you've struggled to understand and maintain long-term intimate relationships, you won't regret giving this your time and attention. Maybe you've experienced a kind of loneliness that has taken root inside a long relationship. It might have come gradually, or maybe it came with a sudden force. For some, it appears like a slow thinning of connection, an erosion that happens almost unnoticed. For others, it announces itself in sharp edges, recurring arguments, simmering resentments, even contempt. The forms vary, but the underlying truth is the same. Something essential is no longer flowing between two people. This video is part of my series on life telos' first principle, so let me explain briefly how it fits. If life telos is to survive, persist, and flourish, then no domain is more central to that process for human beings than intimate relationships. Sexual bonding, co-parenting, the reciprocal coordination of two nervous systems are all the foundation upon which human life has always depended. But reciprocity isn't only vital for partners who raise children, it's the connecting fiber of any relationship. Sometimes the breakdown of intimacy comes without a dramatic event. No betrayal, no crisis, just a slow diminishing of the relational life that once felt natural. Other times it arrives through incompatibilities that refuse to resolve, or the kind of friction that turns every conversation into an argument. And sometimes it fails to even develop in the first place. However it happens, the experience carries a deep and unmistakable message. The relationship is no longer, or never was, sustaining the flow that intimacy depends upon. At the heart of every intimate bond is a rhythm in which two people give and receive, meet and are met, not perfectly, not evenly, but mutually. It's an exchange more like breathing than a formal negotiation. When this rhythm is intact, a relationship feels alive. When it falters, we feel that too. Sometimes as a subtle ache, sometimes as a full body alarm. Although I'll be talking about intimate partnerships, everything I'm describing applies to any close relationship between friends, siblings, parents, and adult children, or long-term collaborators. Reciprocity, repair, goodwill, the willingness to see and be seen, these rhythms are not unique to romance. They're the foundation of all sustained human connection. I focus on couples simply because the dynamics are easier to recognize there, but the architecture is universal. Let's start here. Intimacy depends on reciprocity, where both people offer something of themselves and both feel met in return. It's a dance of attention, openness, responsiveness, generosity, curiosity, and emotional presence. And when this dance becomes one-sided, when one partner is consistently giving and the other is consistently receiving, something in the relationship begins to collapse, often long before either person fully understands what's happening. Love may still be present, commitment may still be intact, but the feeling of a shared world begins to thin out. Conversations become functional, arguments erupt over seemingly trivial things, and the emotional life of the relationship slowly drifts out of reach. What makes this so complex is that reciprocity isn't a single thing. It's made up of many different ways we give and receive, many different currencies, you might say, each one contributing to the lived experience of being connected. And no relationship is balanced in all of them, nor does it need to be. Some imbalances are natural and even complementary. What matters is not a perfect equal exchange in all currencies at all times, but sufficient mutuality, the felt sense that the relationship is alive and each person is responsive and capable of tending to it over time. The trouble begins when the reciprocity falls below that threshold. No one can tell you what that is for your relationship. We have to intuitively feel this and know our own threshold. It's when enough of the vital exchanges go missing that the relationship can no longer regenerate itself. When ruptures are not repaired, misunderstandings multiply, and emotional generosity is routinely eclipsed by defensiveness or withdrawal. Why does this happen? Why do some couples maintain the rhythm of reciprocity even under stress while others lose it so quickly and struggle to recover? In my experience, both personal and professional, the answer has less to do with intention than with capacity. Some ways of giving and receiving require more emotional skills, developmental abilities, or psychological structures that not all partners possess to the same degree. Once the developmental dimension of intimacy is recognized, it's difficult to ignore it. But before exploring that deeper structure, we first need to understand what exactly intimacy is made of, the many forms of giving and receiving, or the currencies that make a relationship feel alive, mutual, and real. What follows is not a list to memorize, but a way of looking more closely at what we give and receive in a relationship. Everything begins with attention, not just looking at someone, but allowing them to matter in the field of our awareness. And to show this, to give our attention, is to say, however quietly, I see that you're here, and I'm here with you. We can show this by turning toward a partner's voice, looking up when they enter the room, pausing to listen. We recognize that our partner is giving us their attention in the softening of their face, the shift in posture toward us, the warmth in their eyes that says, "You're welcome in my world." From attention grows curiosity, our leaning in toward our partner's interior world. Curiosity asks, who are you today? What's going on for you right now? What are you feeling beneath what you're saying? It's expressed in questions that open rather than close, in forward-leaning body language and a receptivity that makes space for the other. It's open and not seeking to confirm what we think we already know about the other. When curiosity is absent, we feel unseen long before we feel unloved. Curiosity then opens the door to mentalization, the recognition that the other has a mind of their own, with interpretations, vulnerabilities, and motivations distinct from ours. Mentalization is how curiosity becomes understanding. Without it, we default to projection and assumptions. With it, we can begin to see and understand our partner more clearly. The effort to mentalize is shown whenever we check our interpretation and ask, for instance, "Is this what you meant?" We slow down rather than assume we already know. The other way that mentalization becomes a currency is when we mentalize about ourselves. We can reflect on our own thoughts and feelings and where they come from. We can cultivate self-understanding that we can then share with our partner. This will help them answer the common question, why do you feel the way you do and do the things you do? When we've been able to give our attention, be curious, and mentalize, we can feel and express empathy. This allows us to connect with our partner's experience beyond our projections and our own expectations and needs. It's the capacity to feel with and not just feel for. We can let our partner's experience touch us without needing to fix or defend against it. Often it's something as simple as saying, "I get it, I really do." Empathy is carried by our voice. It could be a soft hum or an energetic burst depending on the emotion. It could be a gentle nod, a hand reaching out. Empathy can be expressed as affection warmth, touch, softness, the bodily expression of care. But affection is its own currency, and it shows up in hundreds of small, ordinary gestures. It can be as simple as a hand on the shoulder, the caress of a cheek, a squeeze of the arm, a warm glance, or leaning toward each other on the sofa. It can be playful, comforting, soothing, steadying, or grounding. With or without words, it says, I'm here, I feel you, and I feel our connection. It's about embodied presence, expressing what the mind feels. Warmth, tenderness, goodwill, ease. When affection is flowing in a relationship, the whole emotional climate warms up. We relax, we feel met and held. Affectionate couples don't just touch, they reach for each other. Different partners give affection differently. Through frequent gentle touch, eye contact, lingering kisses, adjusting a scarf, a half smile across the room. All of this may seem trivial, but it's not. Some of us are more tactile than others, but an intimate relationship will eventually dissolve without the nourishment of affection. Without it, even the best conversations lack the ingredients that allows intimacy to be felt. And then there's sex. In terms of intimate relationships, I see sex as on a spectrum of ways that affection is expressed. It can grow out of and deepen affection, or sometimes bypass it altogether. Sex is a topic big enough to deserve its own conversation, so I won't try to unpack all of it here. But I do want to say something simple and direct. Sex can foster intimacy, or it can be entirely dissociated from it. The difference can be felt, but when it doesn't feel like intimacy, it can be difficult to know why. In some relationships, sex disappears altogether, and that's one kind of rupture. In others, sex continues, maybe even frequently, but it no longer feels like an intimate act. Instead, it can feel emotionally empty, performative, mechanical, entertaining, but not meaningful, a pressure valve. It can even be good in a physical sense, but still lack depth. We live in a cultural moment where sex has been liberated from its reproductive function and the idea that it should be restricted to long-time emotional commitments. It's become a recreational activity. Questioning this gets read as moralism or repression. People say, as long as it's consensual, what's the problem? And there's nothing wrong with pleasure, novelty, exploration, celebration, entertainment. People use sex for many reasons, and not all of them are about reproduction or intimacy. The problem isn't that sex can serve many functions. It's that we often mistake sexual excitement for emotional connection, and then wonder why the intimacy isn't growing. Sex and intimacy are not equivalent. Sex fosters intimacy only when the emotional connection is alive within it. Sex becomes intimate when the other person is actually seen and felt. Attention and empathy are present. There's an emotional connection. To put a fine point on it, sex fosters intimacy when it's the expression of an I-thou relationship. Our partner is not just a means to our own orgasm. They are an end in themselves, and the orgasm is a shared experience, a temporary dissolving into each other. I'm not saying that you have to come at the same time, but maybe that's something to aim for. There's also the currency of appreciation, the willingness to name what we value in the other. Appreciation answers the ancient human need to know that we're valued by others. It's expressed in gratitude, praise, delight, the emotional lift of seeing our partner's face brighten simply because we walked into the room. It's expressed by acknowledging both the big and the little things that both do every day. It's not just offering superlatives like you're great or you're wonderful or you're fantastic. We take the time to say precisely what the other has done and how it benefited us and made us feel. By the way, this is much more effective than nagging each other about the things they haven't done or have done wrong. Surrounding all of this is goodwill, the basic stance that our partner is not our adversary. Goodwill is the assumption of benevolence. The receiver of goodwill feels, you're not here to hurt me. You're not out to win. You're with me. Goodwill shows itself in tone, patience, forgiveness, and the tacit sense that your partner is on your side. Intimacy also depends on a shared story, a narrative that two people co-author about what is happening between them, what it means, and where they're going. The story has layers. At the most immediate level, a shared story means being in the same moment together, having a roughly shared sense of what this conversation is actually about, what the emotional tone is, and what each of you is trying to communicate. Not mind reading, not perfect synchrony, just a common grasp of the moment you're both in. Deeper than that is the shared narrative that helps both partners make sense of the relationship itself over time. How we got here, what this moment means, what patterns we're trying to break or preserve. And in its broadest, it includes a future both partners genuinely want, a sense of joint direction, purpose, or horizon that makes the relationship more than a sequence of days. We can see a shared story in conversations where both partners are trying to understand the we and meaning making that evolves over time, and the small glances that signal a shared interpretation of something that's unfolding. Without this shared story, even a strong emotional connection can feel unmoored. And when one partner cannot or will not enter into that co-authored reality, the relationship loses the narrative coherence that intimacy depends upon. These currencies don't exist in isolation. They interact, overlap, and reinforce one another in countless ways. But each also stands on its own as a distinct form of giving and receiving. No relationship exchanges all 8 of these currencies equally, nor does a healthy relationship require symmetry in every area. What matters, again, is that across time, enough of these flow in both directions in a way that feels alive and meaningful to both partners. Intimacy falters not when one domain is uneven, but when the overall rhythm of mutuality drops below a felt threshold, when one or both partners can no longer sense the living reciprocity that makes a relationship more than 2 individuals simply occupying the same space. When these currencies move between 2 people, the relationship has the circulation it needs for intimacy to thrive. There are many other currencies I haven't mentioned. I had to trim back my list for this video, but you might be curious to know some of the others that were on my list, like time, support, repair, boundaries, and playfulness. I'm sure there are others that you can think of. Okay, what about men, women, and the currencies of intimacy? Men and women often express the currencies of intimacy in different ways. These patterns have been observed in cross-cultural research, communication studies, and developmental psychology. But they're tendencies, not rules. There's an enormous variation among individuals, and none of this should be taken as a box that anyone fits into. The point is to understand the patterns, not to stereotype all men or all women. Broadly speaking, many men try to love through steadiness, problem solving, reliability, and not being an emotional burden. Many women try to love through emotional presence, shared meaning making, and reciprocal conversation. Neither approach is superior. They simply emphasize different aspects of care and love. And these differences create one of the most common and often confusing asymmetries in intimate relationships. In essence, men often try to protect the relationship from the weight of their inner distress. Women often try to strengthen the relationship by sharing their inner distress. Men hold things in because they believe it keeps the relationship steady. Women bring things up because they believe it keeps the relationship close. Both are acts of care, but they move in opposite direction. A man thinks, if I keep my worries contained, I'm sparing her. A woman thinks, if I tell him what I'm thinking and feeling, I'm including him. Neither is right or wrong. These are different expressions of love, shaped by biology, socialization, temperament, and thousands of years of gendered division of labor. But when they're misread, the misunderstandings are predictable. Men appear distant when they're actually trying to be protective, and women appear overwhelming when they're actually trying to be connecting. I'm not going to unpack all of this anymore. It would take us too far afield, but it's important to say it out loud. Because when these patterns get interpreted through the wrong lens, the result is unnecessary conflict, inaccurate conclusions, and a lot of painful misreading of each other's intentions. Okay, let's move on to something else that fosters intimacy when there is sufficient reciprocal exchange of the core currencies. It's what I call meta-conversations. These conversations require attention, curiosity, mentalization, and empathy at the very least. So, what are meta-conversations? Why are they important? And what does it mean if your partner can't or won't engage in them? A meta-conversation is simply a conversation about how we communicate with each other. It's a way of stepping outside of the immediate content of an argument and looking together at the patterns that keep tripping us up. They allow a couple to identify and resolve communication problems, interrupting cycles of defensiveness, misunderstanding, escalation, or withdrawal. Meta-conversations require both partners to acknowledge and take responsibility for their own less than ideal habits and to name what isn't working for them in the other's way of communicating. When a partner refuses or avoids these conversations or is willing to have them but won't take responsibility for their part, it usually means one of two things. First, they may lack the developmental capacities required, not by choice, but by limitation. It's like asking someone to do calculus when they can only add and subtract. Mentalizing, perspective taking, and stable empathy may simply not be sufficiently available. The other possibility is that they're avoiding meta-conversations because it would expose their relational strategies. A meta-conversation would require fairness, transparency, and reciprocal accountability. Someone who benefits from confusion, deflection, manipulation, or control has every incentive to avoid this terrain. And sometimes this avoidance becomes so practiced, so deeply woven into the personality structure, that the person no longer consciously recognizes what they're doing. Their strategies operate with unconscious competence, and the resulting plausible deniability of intent is a ready defense. Either way, the refusal or inability to engage in meta-conversations is a bright red flag. It means that a primary tool for resolving conflict is off the table. Meta-conversations rely on reciprocal responsibility and goodwill. Whether a couple uses something like Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication or invents their own communication guidelines, the point is the same. Meta-conversations are how communication problems are recognized, understood, and repaired. Couples therapy can also provide a safe place to have these conversations. Without them, conflict is a free fall. With them, we at least have a parachute. Okay, now I think it's important to contend with the fact that human beings don't all grow in the same way or at the same pace. We don't all develop the same emotional capacities, reflective abilities, or interpersonal skills. And although it's common to assume that adulthood is a kind of psychological finish line, most developmental research suggests the opposite. Adults continue to grow, diverge, specialize, plateau, and sometimes regress across the lifespan. As a good friend of mine recently said to me, development is not just for kids anymore. Developmental psychology is a vast landscape. Piaget, Loevinger, Kohlberg, Gilligan, Fisher, Wilbur, Cook-Greuter, O'Fallon, many others have mapped different lines and stages of growth. I'm not trying to summarize all of that here. What matters for our purposes is simply this. Intimacy depends on certain capacities, and those capacities emerge at different points in development. People don't grow at the same pace or in the same ways. Some developmental models emphasize stages, others emphasize lines or domains, and some describe development as more fluid and context dependent. The models vary, but their underlying observation is consistent. Adults differ in their capacity to hold complexity, reflect on themselves, integrate emotion, and sustain mutuality. Very broadly, development moves from more concrete and self-focused ways of relating toward more reflective, reciprocal, and flexible ways of seeing ourselves and the people we love. Among the many models, Robert Kegan's framework has been particularly helpful to me because it describes the key shifts in adulthood that directly shape how we love, how we relate, and what we're able to offer a partner. Before describing the 3 stages most relevant to intimate relationships, it helps to understand Kegan's idea of the shift from subject to object. For Kegan, the subject is whatever we're fused with, the lens we see the world through. When something is subject, we can't step back from it. It shapes our perceptions, reactions, and our behavior without our awareness. The object is what we can look at. It's something we can reflect on, work with, question, and choose how to respond to. Each developmental stage is defined by what has moved from subject to object. As more of our inner world becomes object, we gain flexibility, psychological space, and the ability to act rather than be compelled. Very important to recognize that we don't just move from one stage to the next, we transcend and include each stage. Think of it like this: your hand transcends and includes your fingers. Each finger is important, but they function together in service to the hand. This will become clearer as I describe each stage. The first stage is the imperial stage, love as a personal need. Here, our needs and desires are our subject. We experience love as their fulfillment. This marks a crucial developmental step from the previous stage where the subject was our impulses. At the imperial stage, our impulses are the object. We have some control over them. The thing is that we control them in order to navigate our relationships so that we can gain rewards, get our needs and desires met, and avoid punishments. This is appropriate stage for young children, but not functional for adult relationships. Kegan calls it imperial because we act like little emperors. At this stage, a person has a single center of experience, their own. The other exists and can be cherished, longed for, desired, even adored, but only insofar as they deliver what is wanted and needed. The partner's interior world is not yet fully real in the way one's own is real. To get stuck at this stage as an adult is to be narcissistic. This stage is passed through on the way to intimacy, but is not itself intimacy. The next stage is the interpersonal stage, where love is fusion. At the interpersonal stage, there's a developmental leap. Instead of being fused with our own needs and desires, we identify with the relationship. The relationship becomes the subject, and our needs and desires become the object, something we can modify, restrain, or soften for the sake of the relationship. This is the beginning of shared identity. Closeness feels like safety. Harmony feels like security. We subordinate our own needs and desires for the sake of the relationship. Empathy and mentalization are real here. They matter. They guide behavior, but they're not yet stable. They're organized around maintaining the bond. Conflict feels threatening because conflict endangers the we, and the we is what holds the self together. For some, this will sound a lot like the dreaded codependence, but it's an extraordinary move from the self-centeredness of the imperial stage and expands our world into more socialized participation with others. Many beautiful things emerge at this stage: tenderness, loyalty, mutual caretaking, the willingness to sacrifice for the relationship, the desire to please, soothe, and maintain connection, a genuine awareness of the partner's feelings. But boundaries feel like abandonment. Autonomy feels like distance. Difference feels like disconnection. This stage is where many relationships form and thrive, but then struggle under stress because the individuated self is not yet fully developed. Which brings us to the next stage, the self-authoring stage, where love is recognition. At the self-authoring stage, the individuated self becomes the subject for the first time. The relationship becomes the object, something one can reflect upon, repair, shape, take responsibility for, or even leave. The relationship is still valued and treasured, but we're no longer fused with it. And because we're no longer fused with our partner, we're more able to see them also as a separate person with their own worldview, their own values, their own priorities, their own motivations. Conflict that arises from differences no longer feel existentially threatening. This is the first stage where we can reliably hold our own perspective, our partner's perspective, and the relationship itself all at the same time. This allows for stable empathy, durable boundaries, greater reflective capacity, emotional regulation, accountability, repair, conflict as an opportunity, not as a threat. This stage also awakens new relational needs. The need to be seen accurately, the need for one's complexity to be held, the need for psychological space, the need for recognition rather than fusion, the need for two separate selves meeting, not merging. These are not demands for perfection. They're the natural expression of a self that has its own center of gravity. Hopefully, now that the stages are clear, the relational consequences become visible. 3 mismatches are especially important. First, the mismatch between the imperial and the interpersonal stages. This is one of the most common and most painful relational mismatches. The interpersonal partner cares deeply about the bond, works hard to maintain harmony, and mentalizes in the ways they're capable of. They want to communicate, connect, and please. They feel shame quickly, reflect on themselves earnestly, and try to repair ruptures even when they didn't cause them. The imperial partner, on the other hand, relates through immediacy, need, and self-reference. They're structured around a single center of experience. They react from internal states, read the world through their own needs, and experience requests for mutuality as criticism or control. This produces a predictable sequence. The interpersonal partner over-accommodates to preserve the bond. The imperial partner takes that accommodation as normal. The needs and expectations of the interpersonal partner feel threatening to the imperial partner. The interpersonal partner ends up doing the emotional labor. We could say that both are loving as best they can from inside the structure available to them, but they're loving from different worlds. There's a kind of twist in this mismatch that's important to name. Some imperial stage partners look self-authoring. They talk about autonomy, independence, boundaries, freedom, and not being controlled. They resist enmeshment, push back against demands, and insist on personal space. To an interpersonal stage partner who is already sensitive to shame and conflict, this can look like maturity. It can look like a kind of healthy differentiation that they wish that they themselves could attain. They suspect that maybe they're just being codependent. There can be a feeling of shame for not feeling able to accommodate their partner. But the imperial stage is not the self-authoring stage. The person has not yet passed through the interpersonal stage, so they can't subordinate their own desires and needs in service to the relationship, feel and act on genuine empathy, mentalize in order to understand and not just manipulate, sustain emotional reciprocity, treat the relationship as a co-created reality. The interpersonal partner often internalizes this dynamic and thinks, I'm too needy, I'm overwhelming, I should be more independent. They're evolved. I'm the problem. In reality, the interpersonal partner is the more relationally developed. They simply don't recognize the masquerade for what it is. The next mismatch arises between the interpersonal and the self-authoring stages. The interpersonal partner loves through fusion, harmony, loyalty, and identification. The self-authoring partner loves through differentiation, responsibility, boundaries, and recognition. Recognition not just for their own inner life, but of their partner as a separate person with their own center of experience. Both love sincerely, They're not loving in the same way. To the interpersonal partner, the self-authoring partner can feel distant, too independent, not passionate enough, not immersed enough in the bond. To the self-authoring partner, the interpersonal partner can feel engulfing, demanding, unable to hold complexity, unable to tolerate conflict, threatened by boundaries. Each is loving from their own center, but not meeting the other's needs as those needs are felt at their respective stages. Here's one of the key misunderstandings. When a self-authoring partner recognizes the other as a separate, autonomous self, this feels respectful and generous from the inside, a kind of psychological honoring. But if the interpersonal partner does not yet experience themselves as an autonomous self, this recognition can feel like withdrawal, not respect. What one partner experiences as space, the other experiences as distance. What one experiences as differentiation, the other experiences as disconnection. This makes it difficult to form a stable, shared sense of we. The interpersonal stage cannot yet recognize autonomy as a form of love, and the self-authoring stage has begun to feel claustrophobic in merger and fusion. This mismatch can be worked with, but it requires movement on both sides. The interpersonal partner must grow toward greater self-differentiation, and the self-authoring partner must practice patience without shrinking themselves to preserve harmony. And finally, the mismatch between the imperial and the self-authoring stages. This mismatch is the rarest and the most destabilizing. Ordinarily, the self-authoring person will see the emperor coming from a mile away, but sometimes passions overtake reason and a relationship is formed. The gap here is not a step, it's a chasm. The self-authoring partner brings reflection, emotional regulation, empathy, accountability, boundaries that protect connection. The imperial partner brings emotional volatility, self-centeredness, a lack of empathy, manipulation. The self-authoring partner ends up parenting their partner. The imperial partner feels frustrated by not being able to control their partner. The relationship collapses quickly because the developmental gap is too wide. It's extremely difficult to maintain, and if it persists, it will be a source of frequent turmoil and distress for both. To sum this all up, each stage contains a form of love. Each stage is a natural part of human development, and each successive stage transcends and includes the earlier stages. None of the stages are wrong. The earlier stages are part of all of our development, but become problematic as adults in relationships because intimacy has structural requirements. Love can exist anywhere, but mutual intimacy cannot. And when we love each other from different structures, we suffer. We believe that our conflict with our partner is about the content of our arguments. From our point of view, we believe that we are right. We try to explain ourselves and experience the futility of it. We conclude that our partner is just willfully obstinate. In most cases, they're just looking at the world through a different lens. Beneath the surface of arguments lies the real reason for the conflict. Developmental mismatch. Okay, so that's all relatively neat and tidy, isn't it? How nifty that developmental stages determine what currencies are on board. But I told you this was going to be complicated, and here's the kicker. Even when a person has the capacities for attention, curiosity, mentalization, empathy, and the rest, even when they're developmentally capable of these exchanges, those capacities are not always available in intimate relationships. They're not like personality traits that remain on all the time. They're more like lights that can dim, flicker, or even switch off entirely, depending on the context. Two forces in particular interfere with access to the currencies of intimacy: perceived threat and dependency. These are not abstractions. They're deeply embodied responses that shape how our nervous system allocates resources. Consider perceived threat. When someone feels criticized, unsafe, judged, or emotionally exposed, Even a developmentally advanced mind can lose access to curiosity and mentalization. Threat narrows attention to survival. The partner across from you, the one you love, suddenly feels more like danger than connection. In this state, people don't ask, what's happening for you? They brace, they defend, they protect themselves. The threat might not be real in any objective sense, but if the nervous system registers it, the higher capacities shut down. This isn't malice or immaturity, it's downregulation. This isn't theoretical. Multiple fMRI studies show the medial prefrontal cortex, crucial for perspective taking, goes offline under threat. The brain regresses to simpler, earlier modes of functioning. Dependency does something equally corrosive, but in a different way. When a partner is someone we rely on emotionally, financially, logistically, their distress or instability becomes threatening, not because they're dangerous, but because our life is tied to theirs. Their overwhelm means less support for us. Their confusion means less predictability. Their emotional turmoil means we have fewer resources to lean on. Dependency can make a partner's pain feel like a threat to our own stability. And when that happens, empathy collapses. The mind pulls back. Not from indifference, but from self-protection. This isn't hypocrisy, it's physiology. Many people who can be exquisitely empathic with friends, clients, colleagues, or strangers can become oddly unempathic with their partner. It doesn't mean that they lack the capacity for empathy. It means the stakes are so high and the vulnerability so deep that the very capacities they possess become inaccessible. Stress adds another layer. Under pressure, illness, parenting load, financial strain, exhaustion, even well-developed capacities go offline. Attention narrows, curiosity fades, mentalization is replaced by assumptions and shortcuts, empathy is replaced by irritability or numbness. Stress compresses the bandwidth necessary for reciprocity. A couple may love each other, and both may have the necessary capacities, but neither can access them at the same time or consistently enough for reciprocity to stabilize. And all this matters because if we assume that development alone guarantees relational capacity, we miss the most human reality of all. Capacity is not fixed, it's conditional. The same person who seems unreachable at home may be warm, perceptive, and attuned everywhere else. The same partner who feels uncurious and unresponsive with you may be highly sensitive in relationships that are less threatening or less dependent. And this is why love and intimacy are so complex. It's why the question, what stage are they at, is never enough. The more penetrating questions are, who are they with you? Who are you with them? And what happens to both of you under stress, threat, or dependency? Development gives us the tools, but context determines whether we can use them. Now that we've explored Keegan's stages and the circumstances that can compromise access to the currencies of intimacy, let's widen the frame a little bit and consider developmental psychology as a whole across many different models. It converges on a simple observation. People vary enormously in the emotional and psychological capacities that they bring into relationships, and those capacities unfold unevenly over time. I'm not proposing a new developmental system here, and I'm not asking you to adopt anyone else's. What matters is the broad agreement about the kinds of capacities that tend to deepen with development. Capacities to mentalize, to tolerate emotional complexity, to hold competing truths at once, to take responsibility for one's own behavior, and to repair after conflict. These are developmental achievements, and adults don't all acquire them to the same degree. When two people differ significantly in these underlying capacities, the relationship begins to take on a particular shape. It's not that one is better and the other is worse, it's that they're effectively building the relationship out of different psychological materials. Under low stress, these differences may not matter. Under high stress, they become load-bearing. This is what I mean by developmental architecture. A relationship is a structure, and like any structure, it can carry only so much weight when the materials differ. When both partners have roughly similar capacities, not identical, but close enough, the bridge between them can hold. They can misread each other, hurt each other, misunderstand each other, and still find their way back. But when the developmental gap grows too wide, that bridge starts to strain, not because either partner is failing morally, but because they're navigating the world with different tools, different levels of reflection, and different thresholds for emotional complexity. Under stress, these differences become fault lines, and reciprocity becomes harder to sustain. This is the beginning of relational mismatch. It's not a diagnosis, not a judgment, but an architectural fact. And the experience of that strain on both sides is where we turn next. What does mismatch feel like? One of the most disorienting experiences in intimate life is the sense of living in a different psychological world from the person you love. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for this to begin. You might still be sharing a home, a bed, a daily routine. As something essential feels increasingly out of reach. It can start subtly. You offer a thought, a feeling, or a reflection that seems ordinary to you, and instead of being taken in, it seems to go somewhere you can't follow. It's not rejected, it's not dismissed, it's just not received. There's an absence where recognition should be. First, you explain it away. Everyone misreads each other sometimes. Everyone has off days. Everyone gets tired. But as it happens again and again, a pattern slowly forms. You can see your partner reasonably well, but they cannot see you with the same depth and nuance. You can understand the layers of their emotional life, but they can only grasp a simplified version of yours. It begins to feel like you're speaking across a perceptual gap rather than across a room. This creates a state that's neither rejection nor abandonment, but something harder to name, the fading feeling of a shared reality. For the partner with greater developmental capacity, the internal experience is often one of contraction. You start adjusting yourself so the relationship doesn't strain, simplifying your thoughts, withholding complexity, avoiding topics that require more psychological flexibility than the other person can manage. For time, you begin to speak in smaller versions of yourself, not because you want to, but because it seems like the only way the relationship can hold together. For the partner with less developmental capacity, the suffering takes a different form. They often feel confused, overwhelmed, or subtly criticized, even when no criticism is intended. They may sense that something is expected of them, but can't grasp what it is. Emotional nuance feels destabilizing. Conversations that require reflection or perspective taking feel like a test. They keep failing without understanding the rules. They aren't withdrawing out of indifference. They're retreating from shame, pressure, or the fear of disappointing someone they care about. Because neither partner has a language for the underlying developmental mismatch, both typically interpret the dynamic in moral terms. You feel the other is indifferent, resistant, or unwilling. You feel they're demanding, impossible to satisfy, or perpetually disappointed. What once felt like a shared world begins to split into two parallel interpretations, not because anyone stopped caring, but because the bridge between your experiences can no longer carry the full weight of emotional life. You can love someone deeply and still be unable to reach each other. That's the lived experience of mismatch. And developmental mismatch shapes not only how a relationship feels, but how it functions over time. Long before either partner can name what's happening, the relationship begins to incur costs, structural, emotional, and relational. These aren't abstract concepts. They show up in the daily patterns of the relationship and the inner lives of both people. The first cost is the redistribution of emotional labor. When one partner has greater capacity to reflect, regulate, and repair, they inevitably become the one who monitors tone, initiates difficult conversations, interprets emotional cues, and tries to restore connection. This is workable for a while. Over years, it becomes exhausting. The relationship becomes dependent on one person's psychological scaffolding. The second cost is self-contraction. The more capacious partner starts trimming parts of themselves to reduce strain, simplifying thoughts, avoiding topics, withholding complexity, or managing their emotional expressions so it doesn't overwhelm. The result is a gradual shrinking of their inner life inside the relationship. They begin to fit themselves to the limitations of the system rather than meeting the relationship from their full self. A third cost is the erosion of goodwill. Goodwill is the subtle emotional fabric that lets relationships regenerate. It thins when repair is one-sided, when responsibility taking is uneven, or when attempts at understanding repeatedly fall flat. Without goodwill, even minor missteps feel sharp. The relationship becomes brittle, less able to absorb the inevitable friction of intimacy. A fourth cost is the drift into parallel lives. When developmental differences widen the shared psychological space, the we becomes intermittent. You can still coordinate schedules, share responsibilities, or maintain a household, but the inner life of the relationship becomes thin. You're together, but not really connected. The fifth cost is the collapse of real repair. If one partner cannot tolerate shame, reflect on their part, or re-enter open dialogue after conflict, the repair either doesn't happen or becomes performative. Conflicts then accumulate rather than resolve. Each one leaves residue until the emotional history becomes heavy and difficult to clear. There's also a cost borne by the less developmentally capacious partner. They often feel chronically criticized or inadequate, even when no criticism is intended. Emotional nuance feels confusing, conversations feel like tests they can't pass, and the effort to keep up becomes stressful. Their defensive strategies, withdrawal, blame, minimizing, shutting down, are often attempts to escape shame rather than avoid intimacy. And then comes the systemic cost. Protection replaces openness. One partner protects against hurt, the other protects against shame. Both become more guarded. Strategy replaces spontaneity. The relationship becomes less of a living exchange and more of a managed environment. Openness narrows, and with it the possibility of reciprocal intimacy. These costs don't all arise at once. They accumulate. And by the time they're visible, the relationship has already been carrying them for a long time. What matters is recognizing that these patterns are not signs of a lack of love. There's structural consequences of a mismatch in capacity and or the other factors I've described. A relationship carrying a weight that its architecture cannot fully support. Next, when reciprocity is possible and when it isn't. One of the hardest truths in intimate life is that reciprocity cannot be forced. You can invite it, model it, encourage it, support it, and create every condition where it might grow, but you cannot manufacture another person's capacity. And this raises an essential question. How do we know when reciprocity is actually possible and when it isn't? The presence of mismatch on its own is not the answer. All couples have imbalances. One partner may communicate more easily, another may regulate emotions more steadily, another may apologize more readily, another may hold perspectives more flexibly. These asymmetries are ordinary and often temporary. Children, illness, stress, loss, all of these create phases where one partner carries more than the other. As I've said, relationships do not require constant balance. They require the capacity to come back into balance. Reciprocity becomes possible when there is at least some elasticity, a willingness and ability to stretch, reflect, and return. This elasticity tends to show up in small, almost mundane ways. It's a partner who softens after they cool down, a partner who can eventually hear the impact they've had, even if defensiveness came first. A partner who shows small but meaningful shifts over time. A partner who can hold two truths at once, theirs and yours. A partner who is willing to look at themselves, however uncomfortably. Even if these capacities are uneven, their presence matters. They indicate that the relationship has a psychological give to it, enough flexibility for the system to rebalance after strain. When this is present, reciprocity can grow. It may take time, it may require patience, but the architecture is there. Another essential ingredient is goodwill. As I've said, the underlying stance that your partner is not your adversary. Goodwill keeps conflict within the boundaries of care. It prevents frustration from hardening into contempt and protects the we, even when you're both tired, hurt, or under stress. When goodwill is intact, repair is possible. When it erodes, resentment tends to take its place. Not all barriers to reciprocity come from indifference. Many come from fear. A partner may retreat into defensiveness or shut down because they feel overwhelmed, inadequate, or frightened of disappointing you. In those cases, reciprocity may still be possible, but the pace of growth will be slow, and the relationship will need space, steadiness, and patience. What matters is direction. Whether both partners are oriented, however imperfectly, toward repair and mutuality. Reciprocity becomes unlikely or impossible when there's no elasticity, when the same patterns repeat without reflection, when defensiveness never softens, when responsibility never lands, when repair never goes deeper than a performance, when goodwill has given way to devaluation, contempt, or chronic blame. At that point, the issue is no longer an ordinary mismatch. It's a different category of difficulty, one that has to do with rigidity, not just with growth. And that's where we need to look next. There's another category of relational difficulty, the problem of rigid personality structure. Some people are not simply earlier in their development. They are stuck in ways that have hardened into stable patterns of relating. They don't soften under pressure. They don't grow through conflict. They repeat predictably, tenaciously, and often destructively. In clinical terms, this territory includes the personality clusters A, B, and C, and the traits described in the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sociopathy. I'm not going to unpack these in details here. I'll include references for those who want to explore them. What matters for our purposes is this: these patterns reflect developmental arrest, a fixed structure instead of a stage to move through. They were formed early, defended fiercely, and now operate as an organizing architecture of the person's relational world. Not all personality structures are equally rigid. The dark triad traits and narcissism by itself tend to be developmentally arrested in ways that are difficult to shift. These patterns form the core of the person's identity and usually remain stable over time, even with therapy. But some traits in the other clusters can soften with real effort, commitment, and the right relational or therapeutic conditions. Change is possible, but only when there is genuine willingness, responsibility taking, and the capacity to learn from experience. The difference matters. A partner with some elasticity may grow slowly but meaningfully. A partner with a rigid, exploitative personality structure does not. Patience makes sense in the first case. In the second, it can become self-erasure. And I think it's important to recognize that whether a partner's harmful behavior is conscious or unconscious doesn't actually change its impact. Some people manipulate deliberately, others manipulate automatically because it's the only relational strategy they've ever known. Some control intentionally, others control reflexively, out of terror, shame, or a collapsed sense of self. But intentional or not, the effect on the partner is the same. Reciprocity becomes impossible and intimacy becomes unsafe. This is where many people get lost. When you're with someone who's developmentally limited but still elastic, still capable of reflection, still capable of small shifts, still capable of repair, patience makes sense. Growth is possible, even if slow. But when you're with someone whose personality structure is rigid, fully rigid, the signs are different. There's no elasticity, no capacity to hold two realities, no responsibility taking, no genuine repair. What you get instead is a cycle: charm, rupture, defensiveness, reversal, blame, and confusion. And you begin to live in a fog of self-doubt, constantly recalibrating yourself around their limitations. This is the danger of what my Buddhist teacher called idiot compassion, the kind of compassion that enables another's destructive behavior and keeps you in harm's way. It explains away harmful patterns that are not changing. It mistakes endurance for virtue, and it slowly erodes your sense of reality and well-being. Idiot compassion is not compassion at all. It's a form of self-abandonment disguised as care. What is needed is discernment. Is this a partner who is limited but growing, or a partner whose structure makes growth minimal or impossible? One calls for patience, the other calls for boundaries, firm, sometimes final. The tragedy is that many people confuse the two. A relationship with a rigid personality structure can persist, but it destroys the partner who submits to it. And no amount of love, understanding, or therapeutic insight can substitute for the basic architecture of reciprocity. At some point, the question is not, how do I help them grow? It's, what's the cost to my life if I stay? And that question is not answered by sentiment or loyalty, but by reality, self-respect, and the willingness to step away from what cannot grow. There's still a place for compassion, but not idiot compassion. Compassion that sees clearly, accepts limitation without enabling, and that includes oneself. There's another form of mismatch worth naming briefly, which is not about personality rigidity at all, but about neurodiversity. Some partners live with ASD, spectrum traits, often undiagnosed, which can include differences in social intuition, emotional timing, sensory experience, and the ability to recognize or respond to certain relational cues. This is not pathology, it's not manipulation, and it's not a developmental rest in the sense that I've been describing. People with ASD can be deeply loyal, steady, and sincere, but the differences in processing and relational pacing can still create a mismatch in how intimacy is experienced and expressed. When both partners can recognize these differences for what they are, neurological differences rather than ill will, there's often room for real understanding and adaptation. Okay, let's add a little more complexity and widen the frame again. There's another complication that widens the frame and reminds us that intimacy never unfolds in a vacuum. Every relationship carries far older, larger, and deeper influences than the two people inside it. First, we all bring attachment histories with us, long before adulthood, long before our first romantic partnership. Each of us learned something about closeness, whether it was safe, whether it was frightening, whether it came with warmth or volatility, whether our needs were met with tenderness, rejection, hostility, or confusion. There's trauma, whether dramatic or subtle. This shapes early templates. Some people learn to move toward connection, others learn to retreat. Some learn that emotions were dangerous, others learned that only performances of emotion kept them safe. These patterns are survival strategies. Unless they're recognized, they shape every currency of intimacy, attention, empathy, affection, repair, in unfortunate ways. And then there's also the impact of the larger world we're all now living in. Modern relationships are asked to carry expectations no previous generation had to bear. Partners are expected to be each other's emotional anchor, intellectual companion, erotic match, co-parent, co-regulator, moral ally, and source of existential meaning. Consolidation of roles that used to be distributed across extended families, communities, collective rituals, and culture. As well, we've changed gender norms, the legacy of feminism, economic pressures, fragile social support networks. All of this makes a mark on intimacy and how much reciprocity is even possible. We're trying to do something immensely demanding with tools that haven't yet evolved for this much weight. Holding this wider view allows us to appreciate both the beauty and the limits of our relationships with more compassion, not less. Beyond a consideration of the expanded expectations for relationships in our modern age, we could pause to consider that for most of human history and prehistory, relationships were basically about a practical collaboration in service to survival. Children needed to be kept alive, shelter established, and resources needed to be secured. Fussing over the nuances of emotional fulfillment and intimacy were our last priority. In the end, intimacy is one of the most extraordinary things two human beings can attempt. It asks so much of us, and it offers so much in return. To love someone is to open yourself to both nourishment and wound. To be loved is to become visible in ways that can feel both healing and frightening. A relationship asks us to bring our inner world into shared space and trust that can be met with care. And intimacy is fragile, not just because human beings are flawed, but because it depends on capacities that are unevenly distributed, constantly shifting, and vulnerable to stress, fear, and history. We come into relationship as works in progress. We carry childhood maps, unfinished development, coping strategies that once protected us, but later isolate us, and blind spots we cannot yet see. No one arrives to a relationship fully formed. This makes intimacy not just a meeting of two people, but a meeting of two developmental journeys. Sometimes those journeys align well enough that a shared life can grow from them. A real we, capable of weathering conflict, holding complexity, and repairing what inevitably breaks. When this happens, it feels like a kind of grace, ordinary, imperfect, yet astonishing. But sometimes the journeys do not align. Sometimes one person reaches and the other cannot reach back. Sometimes one partner grows in ways the relationship cannot accommodate. Sometimes the mismatch becomes too wide for intimacy to be sustained. And sometimes the we dissolves, not through betrayal or catastrophe, but through a slow erosion and the recognition that goodwill, responsibility, and shared reality are not mutual. There's grief in seeing this clearly, but there's also dignity. To tell the truth about a relationship is an act of respect for yourself, for the other person, and for the relationship itself. Clarity doesn't have to be unkind. It's the precondition for both compassion and freedom, and it allows love to remain rather than collapse into resentment or self-betrayal. What remains after the analysis and heartbreak and understanding is something simple. The recognition that intimacy is a living thing, sustained by the reciprocal efforts of two people who are willing and able to meet each other in the middle, not perfectly, but sincerely, not always gracefully, but with enough steadiness and humility to return after rupture, not as idealized versions of themselves, but as the ordinary, vulnerable, unfinished human beings they truly are. When that reciprocity is not possible, when the architecture is not there, the deepest act of care may be to stop forcing a shared life that cannot sustain itself, to step back from the fantasy of what might have been and bow to what is. In this way, intimacy teaches us something essential, that human connection is both precious and conditional, that love requires a structure to live inside, and that to honor love, whether by staying or by leaving, is to honor the truth. That truth is the beginning of whatever comes next, a deeper self-respect, a clearer understanding of how intimacy works, and a renewed capacity to meet another human being, someday, perhaps, from a place that is honest, mutual, and free. At the heart of everything I've said in this video, there's another issue that I haven't yet addressed. Trust. How partners build it, lose it, and try to protect themselves when it feels threatened. I'll start working on that video soon, so check for notifications if you're interested. I know that this video has been long, so thanks for staying with me to the end. I started out determined to say everything I thought was important. I hope you found it useful toward understanding and nurturing your own relationships. If so, please give it a like and subscribe and get notifications for more. Leave me a comment. and let me and other viewers know what you think. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.